Welcome everyone to Indigenous Game Design of Turtle Island. We're going to open up first by introducing everyone, and I'll start with myself. I'm Alan Turner, Yahane Alan Turner. I'm Lakota, Black and Irish. I am the creator of the tabletop role-playing game Ehdrigohr, as well as I've worked in the game industry, video game industry, on lots and lots of different titles over the years. And I currently teach game design at DePaul University in Chicago.
Ani, Wabonanong, Indigenous, Minawagika from Dodom, Anishinaabe Kwe, and Dao. My name is Elizabeth LaPensee. I am Anishinaabe, Métis, and Irish, and a designer, artist, and writer of games. Casey.
Well, my name is Casey Koyczan. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and interdisciplinary musician. I'm the creative lead for the VR 360 experience WenazÃ PAC Visions. I'm currently navigating my way through a Master of Fine Arts program at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Let's see.
Tanzi, Meagan Byrne, Hamilton, Ontario, Newton. Hi, my name is Meagan Byrne. I'm Apatuakwasisan, or Métis, and Newfoundlander on my dad's side, and I am from Hamilton, Ontario, and I am the owner and lead narrative designer of Canada's first Indigenous indie game company, Achimostawinan Games.
Oh, actually, something that's probably worth doing is asking everybody where they can be found on the internet really quickly before we dig into things. So the easiest place to find me is at Council of Fools on Twitter.
So you can find me at elizabethlapensee.com, or you can just search for me online and find all of the different social media networks that I'm available on.
Awesome.
You can find me at caseykoyczan.com, nagamusic.com, and on Instagram and Facebook at Casey Koyczan Art and at Naga Music.
And you can find me at Byrne, BYRNE _Meagan, MEAGAN, or at Achimo Games at achimogames.ca.
Awesome. So I guess one of the big ideas behind this panel is talking about the processes that we approach in terms of how we go about creating things, why we create things. And so the first thing that I want to ask everyone is what's your design process? Or what is it that you take into account, or what is it that you focus on that helps you to work through the various things that you currently are trying to build or manifest in the world? And should I go first with that answer?
Yeah, you've been tasked to go first.
Yeah, so
so Alan, I mean, we all look up to you. You know, I think the context for this too is like understanding how much you really led the way for all of us to be where we are.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, you know, it's interesting because for me, my own answer to that question is that it's changed over the years. When I started, it was very much I was just trying to make stuff, and whatever stuff people told me to make is what I made. And then I hit a point where I realized that it wasn't kind of fulfilling the experiences I wanted to create. And so nowadays, what I tend to do is to think in terms of experiences, and less in terms of like game genre and game type, and more in terms of what's the experience, or what's the conversation I want to start, or what's the conversation I want to punctuate with the piece of play that I'm creating. And so sometimes that leads to me creating whole games, and sometimes it just leads to me creating little moments of interaction. But the major point is, you know, especially when I'm focusing in on cultural issues or personal issues, the goal is to figure out what kind of actions and interactions can I give people? What can I let you touch? How do I make you hold a controller? What kind of questions do I encourage you to ask? What things do I get you to engage with? That kind of, on a moment-to-moment basis, puts you into the mental space that I'm hoping that you'll find yourself in, to experience the piece of thing that I'm trying to get you to build a relationship with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think for me, I've had a lot of similar experiences, and I think still even now, there's the work that I do for contracts, and then there's the work that I do for myself, and it's always like this fine line of trying to find balance between the two, because of course, like we need to eat and pay for bills and things like that. So that's the difficulty of balancing that out. And I have sort of like two trajectories to my process that are really core, and one is that I look to Brenda Romero, who talks about the mechanic is the message. And so for me, like, the interactions that can happen within a game and within that space are really vital in thinking about what are ways in which that can be done from Indigenous approaches. So always trying to think through that, and that varies across different games. The other core aspect is collaborating with elders, language speakers, storytellers, community members, youth, if that's relevant to the game experience. But it can range from involving anyone like Mary Renville and Sharon Day in a game like Honor Water, where they actually decided, specifically Mary Renville was not interested in a game that actually had a feedback system or a scoring system, because she didn't want people to feel shamed about their ability or inability to speak the language, our language, Anishinaabe. And so there, some people could argue, is it even a game, because it's really more like a sing-along, and the system does not read the audio from the player. But I try to push back at that and look at how it's still a play space, right? And that in play, the meaning of that is to be safe, to be experimental, to have a space in which you can try out new things or, push your limits. And so to me then, that still foundationally is a game. And I think that that's a part of the process, right? An approach is like expanding out the definition of games. Casey?
My process stems from an art and fine art kind of approach, because that's kind of what I formulated as first, and then moved into virtual reality art, and then more into game design. It's been this interesting kind of process. So I'm really coming from like an artistic background in my approach, and still very new to creating these like experiences or video games. Like, but they always that process always involves culture, environmentalism, and technology. Those are like three things that are within pretty much all of the work I do, whether it be like fine art, VR, video games, or audio, everything. And maybe sometimes it doesn't necessarily include all of those three elements, but there's some sort of mixture between them within all of my work. And the other main factor is my culture itself, and the stories and everything that represents that, and utilizing that as inspiration in order to tell these stories, to retell the stories, but always keeping that core meaning intact. And then just experimentation, and allowing yourself to be inspired by numerous different things. Like sometimes it's just a word, or something you see out in nature or something like that. It feels good to be able to be inspired and create based on numerous different inspirations.
I mostly wanted to tell stories, which came from, like, actually for a while was a kind of a big source of shame, because I didn't have that connection to community. And I always loved making stories. I would create stories for my siblings. Like, I would make up stories about, why we can't go into swamps and that kind of stuff. And then I remember when I was like not much into my teens, somebody was like, well, like, where'd you hear that story? Where'd you hear this story? I was like asked to kind of give the canon, and I was like, am I not allowed to just tell stories. I would never censor it. Well, I kind of did that thing that a lot of people do, where like a long time ago, or I've heard this from so many people. Like, it's all BS, you know that.
Yeah.
It's just a way of like kind of making it sound like it's not a brand new story. But yeah, I think when I became a teenager, I started becoming hyper aware of performance of indigeneity and sort of like who is allowed to perform and who's allowed to perform in a certain way, and that kind of put me in this like weird space. And I started using games as a way of like working through those feelings of like not belonging, working through those feelings of like, what should I do? And then after a while, I started talking with like other Indigenous people, a lot of Métis people, and it was like we all had the same story, just from like a different direction. And so that feeling we started kind of compounding on, and we started talking a lot about the future. And so I guess in my way, I like games to create stories that will stay with people. And also when it comes to my game design, I'm really big on who's playing and what do I want them to get out of it. So I'm always really conscientious of how will the player perceive this, how will what will the player take away. And that comes out of my work doing gamification, where I ran up a lot of times against profs wanting to do these sort of like social science type games where they kind of gamifying poverty, and you're like, well, this isn't gonna get across to the player how frustrating the systems that create these this stuff happens. Like, you're playing poverty. And I started thinking about that in terms of Indigenous games and just the games I made, where, you know, we give the player a gun. What are we telling them to do? What expectations do they carry with that? Who are they in this space? Are they the character, or are they a part of their mind? So these are the things I always ask myself when I'm creating characters. And I think it actually makes, at least in this game that I'm working on now, Hill Agency, was really interesting because we had that debate before we started writing. Was like, well, who's the player here? Yeah, they're controlling the main character, but like, not really. So we're like, oh, it's like her ego and her id, and it's sort of like that void to be like, you should totally like tell your ex-girlfriend to go to hell, like, or also be like, maybe just ignore her. And these are the kind of things I'm like, I think this makes for a better experience for people because I'm being very conscious of how does the player approach the medium.
Yeah, and then like to leap from that, we can, does anyone have anything they want to say about what other people said before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I do have a couple things there, and it's kind of it kind of pulls from something that I'm noticing with that everyone is saying here. On a certain level, story and culture are big parts of the process that we're engaging, and it's interesting because I think one of the things that's very different from the process, the overall kind of macro process that I see happening in Indigenous spaces as opposed to outside of Indigenous spaces, is how our relationship with story, and what's allowed to be turned into what's allowed to be accessed. And it's like and I think Meagan kind of hit on it, this thought of like there are these stories and people are saying who can say these stories and who can do this or that. There's this interesting relationship where in the overall bigger, you know, colonized macro culture, stories are resources, right? They're just these things that you kind of go, if you find it, it's yours, and you can do whatever you want to with it. And within a lot of our Indigenous spaces, stories are relatives, right? And so they are these beings that kind of get invited into a space with you, and what you're allowed to do with them is a function of consent. It's consent between the community and consent between you and the story. And so just kind of doing whatever feels cool to you doesn't fly. And if you want to take something in a different direction, you actually have to sit down and have a conversation with a lot of people before it's considered safe or okay to kind of go down that pathway. Did you does that resonate with anybody, or?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, totally, like too much.
Well, I think it's like a matter of knowing and then following protocol. And
Yeah.
I think that that's something that makes it very important for Indigenous people to be directly involved in game design. So when there is a game that wants to be, you know, involving Indigenous characters or Indigenous themes, then Indigenous people really do need to be involved in meaningful roles beyond consultants, right? But actually as designers, as artists, as writers, as, you know, and even beyond voiceover actors, because I think that's sort of an easy thing that industry jumps to. But really it is that we do have the capacity to be designers and to contribute fully to a team, and that can better happen, that adaptation of stories and what happens with stories and the storytelling process can happen better then. Not just in terms of protocol, but like interesting gameplay and, you know, how that actually gets conveyed through a game. If no one else has anything else, I'll jump on to the next question because this is like a perfect leap.
Leap.
Very good.
Casey, did you want to add anything?
I find it just really relates to the respect aspect of it. For our own cultures and other people's cultures, and it seems like when there is that mutual respect from any sort of developer, whether they be Indigenous or not, with other Indigenous cultures, then it just comes out within the game itself, its presentation and the gameplay, and you could see that, right? Whereas where there's other games where there is indigeneity present, but it wasn't coming from a respectful place, and it's like it begins to be questioned. So, respect.
Yeah. And it can be really noticeable in the design itself. So that's leading directly into our next question, which is, what to you can Indigenous game design look like? And since the way that we've set this up is each of us asks a question and then we give the answer, which is a bit awkward because it makes it look like you're just asking yourself the question, but that's really honestly not what's going on. So then
It's a talking circle.
What do you think? What do you think? So what I think on this is, so for me, Indigenous game design looks like self-expression. It looks like that personal involvement in it, and it doesn't necessarily always need to mean complete innovation. Like it can be for me, I'm like an 80s kid, and so like there's always going to be that touch of, you know, harkening back to my childhood, and that can come out in many different ways. It doesn't have to mean flutes, right? Like it doesn't always have to mean like you have to have flute music. I have had a game with flute music in it. You know, When Rivers Were Trails does have flutes in a like contemporary way by Superman, but then on the other hand, with Thunderbird Strike, Casey actually did the audio for that and was using, you know, an electric guitar, not just for the background music, but also for the sound effects of the Thunderbird as well as you're playing, and like the impacts and like what's happening, right? And so like we can be Indigenous and be using, you know, electric guitars, different forms of rock, and harkening back to the 80s and integrating these popular culture references in our own life experiences while also layering in Thunderbird stories, for example, right? And so for me, my hope is to push those design understandings in ways that make sense for the game. So it has to work for each game, obviously. And so, for example, in Thunderbird Strike, it is a side scroller, but it's actually in the reverse. And the reason for that is very specific. It's because the journey that the Thunderbird takes is in relation to Anishinaabe ways of knowing and our perspective of looking in the direction of the Great Lakes from the north. Right, and so then that changed the perspective, and as well as how scrolls can be read. And so, you know, to change those kinds of conventions and flip things around is something that is exciting about Indigenous games, but it doesn't always have to be that way either. Like, you know, we can have Indigenous characters and focus on the representation aspects, which is really done in When Rivers Were Trails. And that game is a response to Oregon Trail, but also integrates Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. It really was inspired by me contributing as a writer to that game and thinking, well, what could we do if there was a game that was actually primarily Indigenous voices, not just one or two stories, but like our perspectives, right? And so that game included over 30 Indigenous writers. And so from that, then we had to be responsive to the writers. Alan was one of the writers on that game. And we had to then like think about creating mechanics in response to what writers were writing, rather than coming to writers and saying, these are the only mechanics you're allowed to work with. But in fact, because it was a text-based game with visuals in it, we were able to play a lot more with what the mechanics could be. And so that was a really exciting thing to like work in reciprocity with all of the people that were on the team. So those are just a couple of the things. And then we'll jump to Casey.
I feel that that reflective aspect is really impactful. Like the games that we're making and the creations that we're making, they're in some ways a reflection of ourselves and a reflection of our culture, and maybe like a communicative kind of like aspect of cultures, depending on the developers, where they're coming from, and that sort of thing. Like, to me, like Thunderbird Strike seemed like this amalgamation of a few different cultures, albeit telling the story from one culture's kind of perspective. But just that like growing kind of like knowledge from everyone contributed to this goal, right? I feel that for me, within my approach and what I'm trying to make is stories and experiences from my own culture, but also I'm giving myself that creative freedom to constantly experiment and to kind of ask myself the question, like, how could things be? Mainly in the future. Like, I have this kind of like futuristic mindset where I'm always thinking of like how things could be in the future, as opposed to right now, which I really respect and admire. But I can't help but always like look forward, and to kind of wrap my head around that, how like something can be perceived in the future. So yeah, there's many possibilities, and within music and stuff like that, that it doesn't necessarily have to be this, for lack of a better term, stereotypically Indigenous kind of sound, right? Like, one thing within the fine arts world is like, what makes an Indigenous artist? It's like, well, because they're Indigenous. That makes their art Indigenous as well, because it's coming from an Indigenous person, which is up for discussion. But yeah, that's kind of how I kind of approach things and what I kind of foresee Indigenous video games being. And it's fascinating to see how multiple creators bring their ideas to fruition. One game that comes to mind is Maisie's Terra Nova, and how that was constructed in the story that he was kind of telling within this like modern and futuristic kind of realm.
I think for me, when I look at the games I'm making, so like right now, just to give context, my company of our Indigenous staff, all but one are Métis and Cree, and and both the Métis are Métis Cree. So it's right away, I kind of noticed when we started working together on the story and the characters and the world, I had already kind of like drafted out this very vague idea. And they started filling things in, and it was really cool how quickly we all kind of just played on each other without having to explain anything. And I'd never been in a situation like that before. I never had a situation where somebody was like, oh yeah, and then we have them do that, and I know exactly why we're having them do that, and nobody needs any explanation. And it actually took us, I think, halfway through our first big, it was like an all-day brainstorming session on the writing, and I was like, wow, like it just took a minute and I was like, oh, like look what we did. And it felt so good. And it was like, I think we only had one situation where somebody was like, oh, that might be a little too Mohawk. And I was like, and he only knew that because he worked with Mohawks. Like none of us were like, oh, do we have to worry about that? Because, and I can't say what it is because it'll spoil the thing. But that was a really cool moment. And I think the things that make a game Indigenous, or like what it'll look like, is almost like sort of embedded in a level that you may not even be aware of if you're coming from the outside. But if you're, so I imagine actually when we put out our game, we're probably going to have a totally different reaction from one Indigenous group than from like a predominantly Cree-Métis group. They may actually like respond to it much different. And that's not just because we're using language in the game. It's because there are going to be like inside things that I think even when we're putting in, we're not realizing that it's inside. And that's something that I've been kind of thinking about also when it comes to like myself and others who have been disconnected from community, is when it comes back to stories, like those stories kind of travel with you, even if you're rejecting them. Like even if your family has sort of been like, oh no, we're white now, we've never been native, like this is a common story you hear, but there are things and ways of doing things that kind of travel with you through the generations that eventually just kind of become almost like masked with this, like, oh, this is not Indigenous. But then you start talking with other Indigenous people who stayed in community, and they're like, well, why do you do that? I'm like, oh, because my mom told me I had to do that. Well, why do you do that? You're like, because we've always done that. And these are the things I think we're going to start seeing in Indigenous games, especially as more people within the same community or the same nation start working together. So I think that's the thing about When Rivers Are Trails, is we like when I was talking to, oh no, what's his name? Super lovely Lakota guy.
Oh, Carl Peterson?
Carl,
oh,
yeah.
Carl,
When
yes.
I was talking to Carl. Yeah, when I was talking to Carl about like his experience versus like my experience, even though I know he wrote on it, it's just, you can tell like he's just getting more out of it because it's so specific to his community and his culture. And that, I think, is what, I guess it's almost like this is what Indigenous games will feel like as we move forward. And also, you know, I bring this stuff up when I talk to like non-Indigenous people about games, but they just feel different. I think a good example is Lisa Jackson's Badabin. It was a stark difference between Indigenous people going in and non-Indigenous people going in. So like non-Indigenous people were coming out talking about how stressful it was and how kind of scary it was and ominous. And then every single Indigenous person, North American Indigenous, that came out was like, that was so relaxing. I could just sit in there for like an hour. And it was like, that's really funny. And
Context being, it's a post-apocalyptic reality where there's, you know, Anishinaabe language, but then like the whole Toronto, right? It's Toronto has been overgrown by the environment, and
it was so relaxing.
Just some context for everyone, like it's very relaxing for us.
It's very relaxing for us.
Finally.
yeah, Casey totally ties into your work for sure. Yeah.
Yes, and the same thing with Casey's work, where like people be like all jazzed up, and then so many other people, like, because when it was shown at Imaginative, there was a different reaction, and sort of like people who were Indigenous, especially people who were kind of coming from like Dene, were just coming with an entirely different context, had a different experience, and then people who didn't have that context were just sort of like, oh, it's really cool, it's really jazzy, and then somebody who was Dene coming out be like, that was amazing, I really enjoyed that was great, and you're like, oh wow, like there's, so it's almost like it's what speaks, but I also think about things like manga and anime, and how like that stuff speaks to people who are way outside of that culture. So I think sometimes when we talk about like what does an Indigenous game look like, feel like, and how it's like is made for Indigenous, when it is made for Indigenous people, it just hits different. But there's this feeling that I get when I talk to people who are coming from outside of that. They're like, oh, that means it's not for me. And I was like, well, I mean, if you watch anime, that's not really for you. At least it wasn't in the 80s. It was made for Japanese people. Did you like it? I enjoyed it. I think we've almost like commoditized ourselves too much to the point where anything that smacks of is not for you comes across as if you're putting up like a huge barrier, and like, well, that's not what's happening. It's just more that we're making it for ourselves. And you're welcome to partake. Like, it's for everyone.
Some of it's
but
for
I'm
everyone.
salting the soup the way I like it, basically. Helen.
It's me. Yeah, so all of that. Next. No, seriously though, I'd say it's a bunch of different layers for me. I think on a certain level, indigeneity in the game is about visibility, and so if the game allows for some piece of the indigenous experience from the point of view of an indigenous person to be made visible, right? I mean, and as big as broadest way, I think that's a great start. And also, something Casey alluded to, the idea that I'm a part of it. If I'm making it, and I've got this. One of my friends, Ernest Whiteman, he's a filmmaker, and he's a Northern Arapaho, and he did this interesting experiment where he got a bunch of us together to make Hamlet, and it was neat because there was a bunch of Native people, an interesting diaspora of Native people reading and performing Hamlet, but it was very much an indigenous Hamlet, and I don't have good words to describe it, but the experience of it was so much different, and a lot of it was in the body language, a lot of it was in the timbre of our voices, a lot of it was the things that we chose to elaborate on or focus on when we were speaking particular parts. All that stuff spoke from a space that you only get if you come from that space. And I think those experiential things are things that we often miss when we're playing other games. So it's narrative. It's figuring out how to use a new tool that has arrived with an experience that already exists, right? So that's even things like the games, manga, whatever. All of these things are frameworks for delivering an experience, right? They're bottles for us to put some wine into and drink the wine out of, right? So figuring out how do I adjust this thing so that it is my thing that's coming out of it, or it's my people's thing, and also for me it's stepping a little bit away from things that I feel like are more performance of indigeneity. So it's less about something looking. We're saying earlier about having flute music, right? It's not just the flute music. It's not just the feathers. It's not just what have you. It's the experience that those things represent, right? These artifacts we use in a particular way, and so I feel like when we create a space for a game, an indigenous game, invariably somehow you feel yourself in a kind of a real space, a ritualized space where everything has relationship with what's there, and there's a reason for it, and a way that it impacts the narrative, and there's very little stuff that's just arbitrary, and we will often get so specific that we'll throw away the rest of traditional game to focus on that thing, right, that we want people to get across. That goes for like the music that I make as well. Anything that I do, I feel like there's the biggest indigenous aspect is figuring out something that gives people that connection and being able to call it out. I was trying to think of in Rivers or Trails, we were just talking about this, where when we were first when I first sat down to start working on animal stories, and this is a great example of the difference between outside indigenous versus people who are inside indigenous circles doing this. But we had this long conversation about not anthropomorphizing the animals, right? Not trying to make them cute and cuddly, not trying to make them something that's waiting for us to be saviors of, but just kind of establishing that these things are there in a relationship with the ecology just like us. And so it was less about this, oh my goodness, a crow just landed in front of me. What does that mean? Right? Which is very there's this huge ego thing, which is like all of the world is waiting for me to arrive and define it, and in reality, it's it's more the, hey, there's something going on here. Let me watch it, and maybe I'll glean something from it. Maybe there's some learning I can take, but that thing didn't exist just to teach me something, right? So it's going to go on, and it's going to live its life, it's going to be its world, and it's just the intersection overlap between us where we both get something out of it. And I feel like that kind of thing shows up so much more because it's a mindful space that a great many indigenous designers actively choose to put into the games that they're making. But at the same time, we also like to just have fun, right? So I mean, we have our traditional games, like a hand game, traditional hand games where we're hiding the dice and moving around. Those games they're fun games, they're gambling games, but they also have a cultural relationship with everybody around them. So eventually, even those fun spaces grow into these kind of ritual space holding spaces where everyone is coming together to engage it. And I don't see that happening in a lot of games outside of our circle spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I'm hearing across all of us is the shift that's talked about in programming as well, where the emphasis is on relationality rather than being object-oriented.
Right.
So it's relation-oriented, right, across all of the different kind of work that we're doing. Does anyone have other discussion responses?
I just, as soon as you mentioned the crow, I was like, oh, probably just means you had ham or something.
Yes. So I was playing a game this summer, in my COVID summer, of trying to find things to distract myself. No Man's Sky, if you're familiar with No Man's Sky. And as I was playing the game, it was painfully obvious to me that it was not an indigenous game, right? Because so much of this game is focused around you land on a planet. You rip the planet apart to get resources for the planet. You find places where other cultures are, and you get to name that and send it up to a database that makes that naming real. There's all this kind of take mentality that's pervasive in an otherwise beautiful game. And I found myself asking, well, if an indigenous person were making this game, how would this be different? You know, what's the point of view that we would approach it with that would let you get a taste of how we see the world, and where it's not a world that's a world of threat or a world of resources, but it's a world, right? It's a world of relatives, at least from a Lakota space, right? That there's a world of relatives, and so I wouldn't be ripping. I wouldn't just be arbitrarily mining stuff and leaving these big holes in the ground, just to build my massive structures, right? I would be there'd be some giving back to that space. There'd be calling other people around to help me build something out. There'd be trying to balance things out. There'd be planning things out. There'd be all this stuff that's happening, and it wouldn't just be about me going to as many worlds as possible and finding as much stuff and hoarding it into these big boxes of hoard that I may never use, but it's nice to know that I have it in the background. So right. I think being mindful of that when we're creating often makes a difference between whether or not a game, even a game made by an indigenous person, if it carries the indigeneity across. Because it's really easy. As an indigenous person, I can totally just make a blow 'em up game and have fun blowing stuff up, and I don't know if I would necessarily call it an indigenous game, other than the fact that it was made by an indigenous person.
I have a couple things to speak to that.
Yeah.
First of all, World of Relatives sounds like kind of like indigenous World of Warcraft spoof. You can have like all your different aunties and cousins, like
and you can't plant any. You can't pick any of the plants until you've gone and done a quest to learn about the plants first. You can't touch anything.
World of Relatives. This is the next big indigenous gaming.
Who has $1 bajillion for that MMO?
So just trademark that right now.
You heard it here first.
And just to I really that's a really interesting take on No Man's Sky. Like that's kind of shifted my perception of this game, and I found that I was getting into No Man's Sky, like No Man's Sky VR, And I was playing it a little bit. Like, Travis influenced me to buy it, and he was really stoked on like doing multiplayer and stuff like that. It's like, okay, I'll get it. And then I kind of just like put it down. And then when COVID hit, and all of these things were happening, there was a lot of like overwhelming feelings that were happening, and like, you know, each month there's this catastrophe happening and that sort of thing. I found that No Man's Sky was the perfect escape, because you could literally be like, peace out, Earth.
Yes.
Like, I'm taking off for a while. Like, I'm going to go travel throughout the universe, you know? It's like, I'll come back to you later. But, yeah. So I just wanted to say those.
Yeah. I totally did the latter, too, right? I explored an entire world, and it was my playground. And that was the beautiful, awesome experience of it. But then there are definitely points where I felt like a bad ancestor. I was running around just tearing stuff up.
Yeah, I killed way too many of those drones, like right off the bat. So I got up to like level 4 or 5 with the drones, and I barely have my house built. It's just like, so yeah, should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what is sovereignty to you, and how can game design be sovereign? And my reflection on that is, like, it speaks a lot to, you know, our cultural representation, maintaining our independence, but at the same time, having it be open-ended enough where people would want to understand, want to learn more about our culture, our language, but also accept our adaptations of that and how we perceive them. For me, when I started to create virtual reality art, immediately I was drawn from inspiration from like our northern animals and our stories from the Northwest Territories and that sort of thing. Creating it, putting it out there, but not really knowing what our elders think until Davis went up to Delaney and he was showing. Doing like a VR workshop up there, and he asked if he can show one of my pieces, Raven Gods, to an elder, and I was just like, okay.
I know that feeling.
Let me know what they say. And he was like, okay. And mentioned that they were looking around the headset, and they took it off and said, like, you know, I really didn't think much of VR before, but if it's going to be used like this, then it's okay with me. And for me, that meant so much, and it seemed like the only green light that I needed. Like, regardless of what anyone would say about my work or their depiction of it or whatever, this elder from Delaney basically gave me permission to do this. And it's a question that's always been in the back of my mind. Like, am I representing my culture negatively here? And it's like, well, this person says that I'm using it in the right sort of way, so it's like, okay, let's go. So, Megan?
Yeah, it's such a big one. And I'm still in that phase, I think, of my life where I feel like I'm always gonna feel insecure about where I stand as an Indigenous person. And I think one of the things that I think of when I think of like what's comfort and stability for me gonna look like in the future, and I think of language. And one of the things I think of is I have a lot of Maori friends from New Zealand, and you know, the way they just now casually use their own language, even with English, and like actually I'm starting to notice they're parsing out more and more English, and they're speaking more and more of their traditional language, and like they're on Twitter and their friends all understand them, and like for me that's the tell, right? When like your friends understand you and you're all speaking the same language essentially. And like for me, that I think that would be sovereignty, is casual, comfortable use of language, of Cree, of Michif. I think those are the kind of things I've been working towards slowly. Language, I think, for me, language always feels like the hardest thing, because you need other speakers to really learn. And if you're in a place very far from community where, you know, or if you're in somebody else's territory with like a totally different language family, then you're probably never going to get access to your own language. And I know, like, online we're getting access to more and more things, but we still have so few speakers. And we still have so few chances to just kind of like chat. So one of the things that I do in my games is I use Cree language as much as possible. And one of the things I haven't like been given explicit permission, but there's a lot of Cree language teachers who are just like, basically let the young people mess up, let them just use language improperly, and then just gently correct them, because it's almost like asking for a tech question online. Like if you're like, hey, how am I supposed to introduce myself? No one's gonna answer you. But if you're like, hi, and then you introduce yourself in language, and they're like, you pronounce this wrong, and like that's not how you do that for grammar, and they correct you. It's like you have to put yourself out there in order to get the correction. And some people find that shameful, but for me, like, that's language, right? Like,
Right.
Getting corrected is part of language. It's part of being a child. You're constantly being corrected as a child with, you're like, oh, did you mean water? The over enunciation. And so, like, I have never been ashamed when I'm corrected. I always just say thank you. And I've had, like, lots of people generously offer to, like, oh, here's how you do an introduction, and, like, walk me through that and everything. So I think there's the willingness is there. It's just sort of like needing that access, and that's what I always think of about games. It's like, can I have this in language? Will one day I be able to like localize this entirely on my own, or maybe with a team, in more than one Indigenous language, and not just the words like that are the people are speaking, but like the UI, the menu screens, the code one day. Oh man, a Cree syllabic code would be amazing.
Oh my goodness, that'd be crazy.
The Cherokee are working on theirs.
Yeah.
Of course, they're always like,
Yeah. Never still.
The Maori already have theirs.
yeah, which is awesome. It's totally awesome. It's totally awesome. We'll get there too.
Yeah. Alan?
Oh, so sovereignty. That's a big question, and I'm the person responsible for that. I don't really have a good answer, but I think at the end of the day, it comes down to a certain level of authority over your experience. And Meagan talking about language I think is a great example of that, where there's a lot of, when we're out there making, there is that I like that analogy you use, is like asking a tech question, right? You go on people go on the internet and say, hey, how do I go about programming this? And then you'll get a bunch of people, if someone answers, you'll get a bunch of people saying, oh, well, you should research that. There's already a thread about that somewhere else. Don't ask that question. But then you go ahead and do it wrong, and people will pick you apart. And I love that there's that capacity for the language space to live. But I also feel like as young people move forward, they also need the room to be able to shape the language to reflect their experience, right? And it's a struggle. I mean, I have it with my kids, where the first time somebody came home using the term ratchet, I was like, what are you doing? Which is a local term. I don't know if you guys have it up there in Canada, but the point being that there's this recognition of what's been, but also the capacity to make adjustments so that it continues to serve, right? So I think for me that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is just a general authority over your experience, and not to have other people decide which of your experiences are valid. So in games, the example there is more. I started off by talking about how stories, we have this relationship with stories. Very often you'll experience in games, people want to, they already have a game or a universe out there that includes something that they feel is native or indigenous or what have you, but it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible, right? You look at it and it makes your eyes bleed, and you saying, hey, that's not the way that works. This is a better way to do it. You're often not heard, because they have decided they have the authority, and they have read and people that they recognize as gatekeepers of authority, gatekeepers of sovereignty, what is authentic because they collected it. Therefore, they get to decide what to do with it, whatever they want. However, it doesn't work in the reverse, right? So someone may decide they want to, I don't know, in Italy might decide they want to make a game about, some native religious figure, and they feel like they would be perfectly fine to do that. But if we turned around and I decided I wanted to make a game about the Pope, right, or about Jesus stories or what have you, and just do whatever I wanted to do with it, and take it, just have fun with it, that would just cause an uproar, because they have they have sovereignty over that story. They get to say, this is our story, this is the way it is, and you have to respect it. If you're not respecting it, we're gonna stop you. We're gonna pull all this stuff down, and that is recognized as truth. And in our spaces is often not. And when you're in a relationship of collaboration, people often look at you and go, well, why are you causing so much trouble? This is simple. It's easy. It's in a book. I picked it up out of the book. It should be okay. And then you'll get feedback that things like, music is universal. It's for everyone. Stories are for everyone, and we should all have access to it. But that always means your stuff. We should always have access to, but it's not like this natural blend. It's still, again, we're back in the space of a take. So in terms of a sovereignty, it's creating these spaces where our authority over our own narrative is present, is witnessed, and is also validated by those who are on the outside looking in. They're going, oh yeah, you have authority over that, and we're going to wait for permission from you to actually engage that, or we're only going to engage this bit of it, but we recognize what part of it you own. And it's weird because even the very idea of sovereignty is kind of a colonizer shadow thing, right? Where we get to decide what we move out on, what we take, and then once we've taken a bunch of stuff, we get to tell you get to own that. And it's just kind of a weirdness, but it's what we have to work with. And so as we're making games, trying to create games that once people start playing them, they see that experience and they start to know those experiences as truth, and they start to also carry those experiences out and represent them, so that other people are seeing those experiences as truth and recognizing them and validating them, and then we get to a point where we're on the same page. Mm-hmm. And it's also recognizing that we always have these tools that are showing up. I think things like VR, all the different ways that we can create and share music. We've got all these tools available to us, and we can own the way those tools are used to represent us, right? The way those tools are being used to tell our stories. And right now we have like a lot of games mimics cinema, and much of cinema comes out of a particular cultural set of expectations about how a story is told. But as we go into VR, a lot of people are freaking out, going, how do we tell the story in a virtual space? How do we tell a story in a 360-degree space? And it's about telling a story in those spaces you're telling in an ecology of stories. You're telling a story in an ecology. And so maybe that's a place where we actually will shine, because we already have a narrative relationship with that kind of storytelling, right? So it's recognizing where we can stand, where we can hold court, where we can own the pace of the narrative, the flow of the narrative, and then and we get to be gatekeepers on a certain level of how that stuff gets meted out.
Yeah, exactly. That's really what it comes down to for me, like in its most simple form. I answered to Carol Marjuan in Bawaping about the term of sovereignty, because she recognizes just the same that it does come from colonization, but chooses to use it as a way to talk about making and then enacting our own decisions. Yeah. And so for me, sovereignty really is something to empower us within the space of the development process. And so I think about, Meagan with her own company. I mean, that's an incredible act of sovereignty, and Casey doing his own work, and Alan, when you crowdfunded Ehdrigohr, as what is being called the indigenous version of Dungeons and Dragons, and then all of those instances are moments where we do not have to answer to other people in the work that we're doing. And I think that at the heart of it is what sovereignty is about.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but this was an amazing time. I had a great time. Thank you, everyone, for coming at PAX, and thank you all of my co-hosts downside.
Yay! Thank you.
If you want to know more about what we're doing, you can find us online, and I'm also pretty sure our contact information is on the PAX Online website. So really hope to hear from you if you want to ask us more questions, and hopefully we can see you guys next year.
Yeah.
Great. Bye.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye, Pete.
Dokshake.